I'm Sarah Westwood, and I'm here today with Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. Senator, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
The Facebook Oversight Board this morning upheld a ban on Donald Trump. Conservatives have been highly critical of what they describe as censorship from Facebook here. But on the other side of that argument, why shouldn't a private company be able to remove content that it deems unsafe?
Well, a couple things here. I mean, the real problem with Facebook is the monopoly power that they enjoy. Nobody would particularly care about Facebook's censorious actions if there were rival competitors that actually had a legitimate shot at taking away customers, but there aren't. So the real problem is the monopoly that Facebook enjoys and that it uses, and that it's using more and more aggressively. Today's oversight board, I even resent saying the words. I mean, let's just be honest about this. The oversight board is not meaningfully different from Facebook itself. I mean, it's a board that's set up by Facebook, funded by Facebook. Today's decision is just Facebook saying that Facebook will do whatever it wants to do. And maybe the best argument for that is the one you articulated. Maybe they should just be saying, listen, we're a private company. We're going to do whatever the heck we want to do. Those rules and standards that we put out there, we're not going to follow those when we don't want to do it. We're going to censor whomever we want to censor, and you're just all going to have to live with it. That's basically what they said today. The problem with that is the government has helped subsidize Facebook to the tune of billions of dollars with the special immunities Facebook and a few other companies have gotten from federal law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in particular. And now that Facebook has reached monopoly status, it is troubling to see them using that monopoly power to direct it against speech that they don't like. And I think the answer to all of this is to break up Facebook and to break up these companies.
Why hasn't the free market been able to address this? If enough consumers, if enough shareholders objected to the censorship, wouldn't competition yield platforms that don't engage in those practices?
Exactly. You would think so. And the fact that it hasn't, I think, shows you that you have a monopoly problem. This is classic monopoly behavior. Think about the fact that 75 million Americans approximately voted for Donald Trump. That's a good chunk of people. That's a lot of potential customers, probably current customers on Facebook. So why would Facebook engage in behavior that is so alienating to so many of these folks? Why would they target conservatives or pro-life groups as they have repeatedly? The answer is because they're a monopoly, because they don't think that they have to compete to keep those customers. They don't have anywhere to go that's a viable alternative to Facebook. Why would Facebook also talk about buying up Instagram, as Mark Zuckerberg did some years past, in order to squelch competition? It's because they're a monopoly. They can shut out competitors. They can prevent new entrants into the market effectively. They can raise those barriers to entry, and they're doing all of those things. I think that's really the heart of it. For conservatives, I think the heart of this, the heart of the concerns about free speech, the heart of the concerns about the political interference by these companies gets to their monopoly power.
What can the government do to break up the monopoly power?
Well, one of the most important suits that the Department of Justice has filed in many years, at least since Microsoft, maybe even earlier, is the suit against Google, the antitrust suit against Google. Facebook is also now under investigation, reportedly, for antitrust violations. So we've got to enforce existing law. The government hasn't done that in a serious way against these companies ever, against these tech companies. I mean, Google was in the crosshairs back in 2012. The Google CEO talked the Obama administration out of it, flew to the White House to actually have conversations about this, talked the administration out of it. That was a big, big mistake. So we need to enforce existing law, A. But B, Congress needs to update our antitrust laws. For years now, courts have used a standard that asks about consumer welfare when they evaluate antitrust cases. And that really boils down to, is this costing consumers more? Well, the problem with the tech companies, the big tech companies, is that their consumer-facing products appear to be free. Facebook, I mean, free, but Gmail, free. However, they are extracting monopoly rents on the back end, doing things like censoring speech, but also taking our data, taking massive amounts of our personal data without our consent, without our permission. That's a classic monopoly rent. So we need new laws, I think, that make it clear that these companies can't consolidate whole industries under their control, that they can't acquire any new companies, and they need to spin off their subsidiaries. And I've introduced legislation that would do all of that.
So, how do you maintain credibility as a conservative in the traditional sense when you are reaching for tools like regulation, like strengthening antitrust laws, for what's a pretty aggressive free market intervention?
Well, I'd see this as a market reinforcing move, a pro competition move. This is why when we talk about regulation, I would prefer to break up the companies and allow competition to flourish in the market as opposed to regulating them as arms of the government. I think this is something you see Democrats more and more reaching toward. They actually love the power that these big tech companies have. They love the concentrated monopoly status. Why? Because the big tech companies can censor speech and engage in activity that the government never could. So what the Democrats want to happen is they want to regulate the companies into further censorship, into further control, and they want to further entrench this big government, big business alliance. I think we ought to break that up. So my view is let's let the market work. I mean, we have long said that the defense of capitalism is anti-monopoly, right? Those two things don't sit well together: monopoly and capitalism, monopoly and free markets. So I actually think it's market reinforcing to have a robust trust busting agenda. And that's what I propose. I talk about in the book, and that's what I proposed in legislation.
But even if you were to break up those social media companies, how would you address the so-called woke culture that would still be pervasive with whatever's left of the industry? And that's pervasive in parts of corporate America that those prescriptions wouldn't necessarily affect.
I think one of the reasons that the woke mentality and the cancel culture that it helps feed, why that is so troubling, is because of the power that these companies have. So I get back to the monopoly. The monopoly status of these companies makes their political interventions much more salient and much more troubling. I mean, again, if Facebook was a smaller company with a lot of competitors and they were pushing a lefty agenda, then you might say, well, okay, they're one of whatever, four, five, six, name your number of viable social media companies. Go somewhere else. I think the fact that you have a dominant platform where there is no real competition and they therefore have political power that they can leverage, that's what really makes their woke views all the more dangerous, because it really does make them politically powerful. Now, listen, to your point though, I mean, would breaking up these companies change the views of their CEOs, the woke views of their CEOs? No, probably not. But hopefully it would inject some competition. And hopefully you might get some new entrants into the market who would say, like Parler tried to be before it got canceled. We want to appeal to the millions of Americans who hold a different set of political views. And that competition, I think, is really a healthy thing.
How do you balance the public safety concerns that these social media companies claim they're trying to enforce when they engage in what you're calling censorship with the free speech ideals that you're also talking about?
It's interesting. The companies have actually been trying to wriggle out of their true public safety responsibilities for years. I mean, my view is that they should be obligated to take down content that is illegal or that they should know is illegal. And what's actually happened is these platforms have let gobs of material, child pornography, for instance. I mean, heck, YouTube was actually helping pedophiles find videos of children. They were doing that with their algorithm out in the open. So here they are actually promoting, in many cases, indecent material, certainly allowing it to be out there, while at the same time saying, oh, well, we got to regulate speech. To me, it should be exactly the opposite. Yeah, conduct that is illegal and that the companies know is illegal, or that they should know, given all of the circumstances, that we call that constructive knowledge in the law. That kind of conduct they ought to be on the hook for. And by the way, that's why we have the Communications Decency Act in the first place. It was supposed to say that if companies know of illegal behavior or illegal activity on their platforms, they should be able to take that down without being sued for it. That's a very different proposition from what the companies are now saying. The companies are now saying, well, yeah, that whole thing about illegal conduct, I don't know, we can't really be blamed for that, but we definitely want a lot of power over speech. And we want to decide what's offensive speech or not. And we want to be able to take down and regulate offensive speech. And we don't want to be on the hook for that. We don't want to get sued for that. To me, that really gets the balance pretty much exactly wrong.
You're talking about a skewed balance here. Do you think it was correct of social media companies to remove election misinformation and to remove posts in the lead up to the January 6th riots? Was that a correct move on the part of social media companies?
All depends on what you mean by election misinformation. What a lot of these companies were doing, YouTube, I think, for example, if memory serves, was actually taking down videos of, for instance, folks talking about previous electoral commissions. For instance, the Carter Baker Commission. I could be getting the name wrong, but commissions in the past, bipartisan commissions that, for instance, had raised concerns about universal mail-in balloting. And that was getting tagged as, oh, if you question universal mail-in balloting, that's an attack on our election process. That's misinformation. We're taking that down. That I think is crazy. I mean, that's crazy. And this is what happens when you allow these companies to start deciding that, what we'll do is we'll decide what speech is offensive or not. We'll decide what is politically viable and politically allowable or not. And if we don't like it, we're just going to take it down. I think that's too much power, and I don't think that they ought to be doing it. Now, again, they're private companies, so what the real danger here is, and where the rubber really meets the road, is their monopoly power, which gives them that control over speech and makes their decisions so important. And then also the federal government subsidy in terms of Section 230 that these companies benefit from. So the question is, should they be getting that special immunity deal while they're also trying to be speech regulators? And should they be getting that special immunity deal when they have monopoly status?
And finally, in the House, we are seeing a leadership fight that basically boils down to differing opinions on how to move on from January 6th. You personally have faced criticism for raising an objection on that day to the electoral votes. But broadly speaking, how do you think the Republican Party should grapple with what happened that day and move forward? Is it by continuing to examine it further, or is it by leaving it in the past and not talking about it anymore?
Well, by it, do you mean the riot? I mean,
The riots themselves.
Gotcha. So, well, first of all, I mean, we absolutely need to prosecute and hold accountable criminal rioters who assaulted cops, who stormed the Capitol, who broke the laws. I mean, absolutely, and that's true no matter what your political ideology is. I said this all last year. I will defend people's right to protest peacefully, whether I agree with them or not. I did that for the BLM protesters. I said they have every right to be out and protest peacefully. What they don't have a right to do is storm federal buildings, attack cops, burn businesses, shoot people. The same is true of the Capitol rioters. If you gather peacefully, that's protected First Amendment activity. But as soon as you start engaging in unlawful conduct, you start trespassing criminally, you start assaulting cops. No, you are a criminal. You have broken the law now, and you need to be prosecuted. And I think that as conservatives, we've got to absolutely hold to that line. We'll defend the First Amendment rights of anybody to protest, whether we agree or not, but we're absolutely not going to condone violence of any kind for any reason, period. And I think that we've got to be clear on that. In terms of moving forward, though, your question was about moving forward. I think we have got to be the party that offers new solutions to this new era that we find ourselves in. We're a working class party now. We need to be the party of working families. We need to put forward solutions that will help working people. I think a trust busting agenda is a big part of that. I say that because there's a lot of economic data that suggests the more monopoly power there is in the economy, the less share of our GDP goes to labor. And so it actually helps suppress wages. So I think a trust busting agenda is a pro-worker agenda. We need to be in the business of supporting families. And I propose some legislation to do that with a parent tax cut. So there's a lot to discuss there in terms of the specifics, but I think we've got to look to the future in terms of being a pro-worker, pro-family party.
Just to go back to the first part of your question, though, politically, the sentiment that underpinned that riot was misinformation about whether the election was stolen. Do you think that it's helpful for the party to continue to point out that that was misinformation, that was not accurate, or do you think it is more helpful to leave that discussion in the past and, as you're saying, sort of pivot to a new agenda?
Well, I think we do need to talk about election integrity, and what makes that particularly relevant now is what the Democrats want to do with H.R. 1, for instance. That's the House bill that would federalize our elections. And I can tell you, coming from a state in Missouri that has, for instance, voter ID, that has notary requirements, signature requirements on mail-in ballots, that legislation would upend, the Democrats' legislation would upend much of Missouri election law. That's a big deal. And I can tell you, for voters in my state, that's a very big deal. So election integrity is something that really matters to voters in my state. It's something that they really care about. And I think the Republicans need to be prepared to talk about that and to talk about why that kind of legislation, that sort of federalizing takeover of our elections would be a big, big mistake. We've got to combine that, I think, with, as I said before, a pro-worker, pro-family agenda.
Thank you so much for your time today, Senator. We appreciate it.